Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the Biomass Task Group as we try to kind of bring our recommendations to a close for the Climate Council. A few things, reminder of the ground rules: be present with a clear mind and open heart, listen generously across differences, ask for what you need, speak your truth while tending to the impact of your words, and honor complexity. And appreciate the really good work you all done in really following those as we tried to work through this document with a lot of constructive dialogue and conversation. Today, we're going to do a quick, agenda review, which I'll do in a second. We just did the ground rules. And so our goal is kind of threefold. There's kind of three outstanding issues in the draft recommendations, the core recommendations that we need to go through that we were kind of close to, but not quite there yet on last time. So we'll go through those three. Then we want to talk about the opening section, which Jane and I tried to craft something for context, recognizing the findings document was so long and trying to summarize that is hard. So we don't know how we're going to do on that, but we'll give it a try other than the process piece, which I think is straightforward, but we'll give a try on that after public comment. And then we want to talk about how we're going to kind of engage with the subcommittees before we get to the Climate Council. So that's kind of our three tasks today. Any questions about the agenda? Okay, Jane, I guess on the minutes, any additions or corrections to the November 9th minutes, which is the last time that we met, as you all remember, where our primary focus was obviously the document, but any questions or comments on those minutes? Okay, hearing none, I think we'll consider those approved. Public, what we'll do is we've got a public comment scheduled for 9:30 and for 10:15, but it's kind of between each section. So if we get done sooner, we'll do the public comment then. If it's around that time, we'll do the public comment then. So just we'll make sure it kind of fits within the sequence of the agenda. Okay. I think with that, Jane, do you want to pull up the document and let's look at all three, and then we'll go back and work through each one. I think one's really straightforward, but the other two may take some more deliberation. Okay, everybody see that on their screen okay? All right, so on number 3, which is really around the McNeil and Rygate facilities in particular, we've really been wrestling with the if, when, and how phraseology. So we've got 2 bullets we need to figure out whether to leave both in, pick one, write something else, but that's one piece of work we need to do this morning.
I'll just flag that this bullet, for everybody's memory, came back in because it was lifted up by Jared Duval as a counselor when we were having discussion with the subcommittee in the second half of our last meeting. So this was the language that he suggested as a revision to the language above, and that's why I have it there as an alternative. And maybe, Pat, I'll just say a process point before we sort of dive in. I do really think that the decision point ultimately around some of these challenging components of language should lay with the Climate Council. I mean, counselors have to wrestle with these kinds of language decisions. And if this group can't reach agreement, I think it's okay to have 2 alternatives flagged and agree on the language of the choices, and then have a comment or have it communicated when it's presented to the Climate Council, the differing views on the language, and if we need to kick that decision up to them, because ultimately they'll likely wrestle with the language themselves too. So just putting forward alternatives where we can't have full consensus, I think is an appropriate response if you all want to proceed that way.
And I want to just kind of go through all 3 before we dive into the substance. But Charlie, did you have a process point before I just review the other 2 we need to talk about too?
No, I was just looking for some additional insight into Jared's comments and essentially how these 2 are different. But if we're going to come back to this, then I can hold that question.
Okay, great. We'll come right
yeah.
back. Jane,
he put the if back in, you'll see, and he also really wanted. I think both of them now have this over different timescales. That was language that was added to both that hadn't been there at the beginning.
And
Okay.
Jane,
So,
Jane, before we dive into each of these, I just want to remind the group of all three. So that's all, just so we don't get too in the weeds yet. Okay, so let's go to the next one, just for an overview, then we'll go back. Sorry. Then there was one we just, I think, is all set to go, but we, in the comment section, we noticed there was some an addition that we added. Jane, do you know where that is? There was like just a word, I think.
oh, this is testing my memory now. I can,
Oh, there it is.
the
Right, the
previous studies. I'm
Right.
so glad I flagged it, yeah.
Yeah, so I think there was a comment that said you need to, in the work that we do with the adjacent communities, the affected communities, we need to actually look at previous studies. So we added that language. We'll just confirm it, but I think that's pretty straightforward. And the last one we need some more discussion about, and that is the question of exactly how to kind of ask for and when needs to happen the public health and air quality monitoring work. So we kind of didn't get to close that. We had a conversation and kind of ran out of time last time. So that's the third issue. Okay. So just want to kind of name all three. So Jane, sorry to interrupt. So I think back to that first one, that under number 3, Charlie, you had a question. So I think, Charlie, let's start with you and let's have a conversation about, this language, different language, multiple language we want to use, however we want to do it. So Charlie.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just, in rereading both options listed, I mean, unless I'm missing something, it just seems like the only differences are that the order of when, how, and if are different. And then there's the phrase depending on the study results. And I feel like depending on the study results is kind of implied in the whole thing. And I don't understand the implied differences in how we list when, how, and if. So I'm just curious what the conversation was around the sequencing of that and whether that was intentional in terms of changing that.
The only thing I remember, Charlie, is I'm not sure about the sequence, but I think the if with the clause that was related to it. Hey, welcome, Richard, by the way, was really just saying that the if is the people were saying the if would you consider the if after you got the results, right? I think people were, I think, anxious to say definitely they should be closed until they got the study results. So that was linking the if and the study results together, I think, was the reason that was phrased like that. The order, I don't know. Jane, do you have any other insight on that? And then I'll go to Liz and Richard.
These say the same thing, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, that was my take, Billy.
It says exactly the same thing, but one word is in a different place. So I don't see what we're discussing.
It may be a distinction without a difference. Let me go to Liz and Richard, and then we'll see. So Liz, over to you.
I'm fine with the highlighted alternative language. I agree with Billy and others that it's essentially identical. And I think that my memory of the conversation is folks felt greater clarity by putting in depending on the study results. And so that's fine with me. I suppose I think Jared, my memory was going for slightly more specificity is, I guess, what I would say. So I would be fine with that one.
Thanks, Liz. Richard, then Chase.
Yeah, I'm sorry to be joining late here. I'm sorry. I would take the phrase "if depending on the study results" out of the second alternative to make the contrast with the first alternative more clear. And I mean, as it happens, as you know, I can't imagine any study results which would end up recommending keeping the plants open indefinitely. So that's part of the premise of my remarks. Sure, we need to understand all these other factors that are mentioned in the introductory paragraph of this section, because they relate to the when and how, but they don't really relate to the if. And I would like to keep the contrast strong between the first and second bullets by removing that language, if depending on the study results.
So just to be clear, Richard, you would leave both bullets in and then just revise number 2?
Yes.
Okay. Chase, you're up next.
I think I'm mostly just agreeing with what Richard just said. The alternative as it's redrafted is the first, and so it's not actually really an alternative. I think that if I'm recalling correctly, the sort of difference of opinion among task group members was around whether if should be included at all. And I think there's a subset of folks who think that figuring out how and when to phase out is really what's most important. And there's a subset of folks who would like to leave on the table whether or not we continue burning wood for electricity generation. And so I think that the change that Richard made sort of more accurately represents the difference among members of this group. And so if our goal is to present that to the Climate Council where they will consider it, then I think that this would be the better approach. On that process question, I do wonder though, since Climate Council members haven't read the peer-reviewed work that we have or attended the presentations by experts on this, it seems a little odd that we would have the procedure be such that they would then sort of call balls and strikes on these kinds of things. So I guess on the specific language question, yeah, removing the if and depending on the study would make sense. But then on procedure, I'm a little curious about why we would take that route. Thanks.
And Chase, Rich, just be clear, which route were you talking about? Like having an either or for the Climate Council versus a definitive recommendation?
That was my understanding of what was said of how this might be presented, like that we would have two alternatives, like that there was a bit of a difference of opinion. Some folks would like to leave the possibility open of continuing to burn wood in Vermont for electricity generation. You know, the owners of the facility and others. And so whereas other folks would like to figure out a plan for when, you know, which might be multiple years and how, you know, with a just transition, things like that, to phase the facilities out in sort of a responsible way. And so, yeah, I saw that as sort of the key rub, if you will, key difference.
Okay. And look, I think if we can get to common and singular language, it's probably better. So let's see if we can get, I think Jay was just offering an option if we can't. All right, so I'm trying to look at Jane, I want to make sure I'm clear. So the first bullet, the first bullet and the second bullet now still look so similar to me. Wouldn't we just leave the first bullet out and take out the second? But Richard, I think you were suggesting leave both in. I just wanted to understand that better.
I was trying to be fair to the diversity of views on the group.
Right.
And if we're going to present alternatives for somebody else to look at that reflect our diversity, then we should reflect our diversity.
Liz, I'm curious as number one, the bullet one is written, if you could live with that one as well, or feel like you strongly need the second bullet.
I think I'm very confused at the way you're doing this. The second bullet is different than the first bullet, to be clear. Okay.
That's correct.
I have been and remain a proponent of keeping if in. And I was fine with the way Jared had phrased it. I agree that it wasn't much different, but his reference to, you know, if after, we've lost the language now, but if after, you know, depending upon results of the study or whatever he had, to me, that gave a reason as to why there was an if, and it's implied anyway, so it's fine. But yeah, I don't know why we're doing it this way.
Okay.
So.
All right, so Liz, I think if we just went with the first bullet, it sounds to me like you could live with the first bullet. So it's got
No, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to have the second bullet is the alternative to the bullet as Jared has written. And that the second bullet is now where I think Richard and Chase would like it to be, and Judy, perhaps some folks. And I'll revise the language. Just give me 1 second to bring back Jared's. I understand what Liz is saying, so hold on a minute. I think.
Yeah, so Jane, let's work on it and then try to be clear, because let's give you a second to do that. Judy, go for it while Jane's fixing that.
I kind of agree with Richard, and no surprise, right? That why are we questioning if? Because we know how bad it is. Shouldn't we just not have if and acknowledge that all the research we've done has showed already it should be closed?
And I think that my understanding is that's the if is where some people feel like they cannot agree only to the how and when. They need the if in there because the study results might suggest there's no better alternative. They're not saying that there is no better alternative, but the study results could suggest that. So they feel like the if is dependent on, to Liz's point, the results of the study.
Okay, I think I have it back. So I think this first bullet is the language as Jared had proposed and Liz would like to see as one option. And then the second bullet is a stronger bullet that takes out the if.
Right. Correct.
And this is where I was just suggesting that we might not be able to reach agreement. And so if we were comfortable with these two options based on the differing opinions, then when we present it to the Climate Council, each side could make an argument for why the language is different and
Jane,
represent those various opinions.
Jane, this is totally minor, but could you actually call this like option 1, option 2, just so we are really sorry to be so nitpicky. Adam, over to you.
Yeah, I guess I'm rereading this, and I thought the whole reason we had if in there was because there was a sub bullet that had been pulled in recommendation 4 up into 3 about the district heating, and that was like, you can't say close it, you know, when, if we're simultaneously saying we need to look at but I don't see the thermal add-on language. Like, where is that? I thought that was included.
We folded all that down into this bullet here. It was too hard. We were finding it too hard to link it all together. So it sits by itself in this bullet.
Okay. So if we're saying we're going to consider that, then that implies an if. So like, I just want to make sure that we're clear that's the reasoning for the inclusion of the if, because if you don't have the if in there, you have two contradictory things being said in the same set of recommendations.
I think, just to make things complicated, I think there's 2 drivers for the if. One would be, geez, maybe you could just do thermal district heating with these plants and close down the electricity side, right? That's a possibility. But I think there's also an if for some people, as I understand it, that maybe the load that these provide isn't easily replaceable, so they should continue to operate for a period of time. So I think the if has 2 drivers behind it. One, Adam, you said specifically to the thermal question, but 2, I think, particular to the study itself and whether or not they are still needed or not because of alternatives. Richard.
I'll just comment that the issue for me is burning large quantities of wood, whether it's to generate electricity or to generate heat. The issue is the same either way.
And Richard, you're obviously concerned about the inputs and emissions and outputs, regardless of what you're producing it for.
Yep.
Judy.
And the first sentence of 3, aren't we suggesting to phase it out? And doesn't the if contradict the phasing out?
Let's go look at 3. I think I'm not entirely sure it's a good question, Judy. I think the plan and prepare for people agreed to, because it didn't mean you should, but you should plan for. And that was the language we kind of, I think, worked on several meetings ago that kind of allowed people to accept that opening statement. Whether it's fully consistent, I don't know.
Well, I'm planning for it to close and preparing for it to close. So somebody else may see it different, but that's what I'm thinking that sentence says to me.
Billy.
Thanks. In the interest of time, I might suggest that given we were provided specific feedback by the Climate Council on this point, that we move ahead with these 2 options, since they seem to capture the range of views on the task group and move on.
I mean, I think to Billy's point, we've had some pretty good, really good and very constructive deliberation about whether or not to include if, and I think We just have differences of opinion about that among the group, to Billy's point. I don't know, we can talk about it further. I don't know that we will get any further with some think we should leave it the if in, and some people think we should take it out. And Chase, that doesn't address your concern of trying to have a single approach. So if people can think of bridging language or something that might bridge the difference, great. If otherwise, I think we might want to move with Billy's suggestion. Why don't we do this, Jane? Let's leave that is for now. Let's go to the next one and the third one, and then we'll just have any reflection on our final work here, take public comment, and decide if there's anything else we can do. So under number 6, there was a comment from an earlier draft I thought was good to include, that noted that the work that would be done in the neighborhoods would also need to look at, not only look forward looking, but look at any previous studies that have been done. So that language was just added, and we thought that was a good point. So we don't think it's controversial, but just wanted to be transparent about changes. So we've added the word previous studies into that list. Any concerns about that, Chase?
Yeah, no concerns really. Just curious to know where that change came from.
The document had from I don't know how many earlier versions. The document had a number of comments off to the side that many of you had given at one point or another in the last month. And so as Janet went through all the comments on the side to see what to do with them, it was hanging there, and we realized we hadn't addressed it. I don't know the original suggested that.
Yeah, I know in our conversations about with the public engagement task group, there's been quite a lot of engagement in the Old North End as of late through both UVM work as well as the more recent work with Center for Whole Communities and Rights and Democracy for DEC. And I think there was just an appreciation, I know in the public engagement work, that makes sure that we're not going to the same people again, asking the same questions, and really thinking about how we approach people in a way that's constructive and additive.
Any other questions about that or concerns, Liz?
One just request that you scroll a little bit so we can see all of 6 together, just for a second.
Yeah,
okay, great, thanks. Okay, good. The Department of Health. Yeah. Let me just see how that reads. Adverse. Yeah. I guess I'll withhold for a moment whether there's some fundamental concern with 6 because of this, but I think I had been among the people who had asked the Department of Health be specifically listed here. I do still have some concern that we're not centering the expert state agency that has, either conducted or coordinated the prior studies and understands where they have come out in the actual engagement. I understand why, of course, we have the Climate Council subcommittee involved in that, but it just seems like it feels like the coordination should be up front. So I think I had made that comment previously, and I can't remember if it was just rejected or we just didn't engage with it, but
Liz,
it feels like they should be in coordination from the beginning, even on the outreach side. Because I mean, how do you design the engagement and the questions, and how do you make sure that the information you're getting back is useful? All of that stuff that feels important to me.
What if we, Liz, I'm going to try this out. What if we said the Just Transitions Committee, in partnership with the relevant subcommittees and task groups of the VCC, and in conjunction with appropriate agencies such as, so we move that last up to that list. Does that work?
Having that up to me would feel better. Yeah.
Okay. In conjunction with the appropriate, and Liz, Janet, you can just copy
that.
Should
I just say Department of Health, or should I say?
I think we're just.
Why don't I just say Department of Public Health?
And I think all we're doing is moving the bottom clause up to the front. So you've already got the clause down with the Department of Public Health and state and the SHPO. So I think it's just moving that up.
Okay.
Yeah, I think just to be, because I think it was important to include the SHPO there too.
May I just, the name of the agency is the Vermont Department of Health.
Let's get that right. Richard, thank you. I've been known to mangle many state agencies' names because I work across states, so I always get it wrong.
So take the word public out of that, where your cursor is there.
just Department of Public, it's Vermont, Department of Health.
Great, thank you.
You bet.
Say anything you want at me, but spell my name right.
I can't figure out what just happened to the bullet. That's what I.
I think all you have to do is just get rid of the 8. If you go, sorry, if you put your cursor on the comma before, after should, and then you just delete, you'll end up back with connecting everything together. Yeah, there you go.
But it's not.
There you go. Yep, that worked. And see, let's go down further to blend number 7.
Should have a comma there, right?
Okay.
It's not making sense right now.
Yeah, I don't know what quite happened to, let me actually pull up hang on a second. Let me pull up the version from that was on the website in just a second here.
I have to pick it. I have it open too. Hold on. Respectful, consistent, ongoing.
Previous studies and needs for these communities may extend beyond biomass, period. Adverse impacts, is that in there? Adverse impacts to public health from particular matter, quality of life, and cultural resources should be assessed and quantified pursuant to the study discussed in recommendation number 3. And then after number 3, you just do period. And then because we've moved that clause up.
Hold on. Let me just. I just need to think and do it for a second by myself. Let Chase talk, and I'll reshare.
No problem. Put yourself on mute and go for it. Chase, go for it.
I don't want to complicate things. I can hold my comment.
Okay, maybe let's let Jane finish this person, then we'll come back. Let's look at the paragraph as is, and then. Jane, thank you. All right, let's look at number 6 now. There we go. Okay. So I think, Jane, that looks to me like what we talked about, what Liz had recommended, moving that language up. We include previous studies, so on and so forth. Chase, go ahead.
My question or comment is about the final sentence of that paragraph. Starting with the words adverse impacts public health. I'm wondering if that should just be moved up into paragraph number 3 or recommendation number 3 rather than have it sit down here. If there's a good reason to have it sit here, that's fine. But it just seems to me that it might be a little clearer if we moved it up.
So that would be part of the but paragraph 6 would focus solely on engagement. And then that last clause would be specific to the study undertaken for number 3 as part of this overall study for a number of things. Is that right?
It seems like that's what it's suggesting. And so I would just propose that we move it up under 3. So it's not muddy things.
Chase, can we do this before we do that? Can we look at number 7? Because 7's more related to the study itself. And so there may be a connection to 7 too. So let's, if we just, I don't want to lose that. I just want to hold it. Let's look at 7 and then talk about 7. So first, before we talk about the yellow language, just read all of 7, all of it, so we kind of know what's in it. And also think about the comment Chase just made. And I think where we did not close last time was my sense is people did not agree with the content, but they agreed they were wrestling with the wording around timing. And some people said as soon as practical, other people said, no, we just need to say immediately, right now, get it done. So I think we need some thoughts on this paragraph generally, but I think most importantly on the timing question. Any thoughts about either of those languages or a different word that might work for everybody?
As before, get the Vermont Department of Health's name right.
Yeah, let's fix that again. So Department of Health. Thank you, Richard. Liz.
I think I was in favor of keeping the immediacy around the assessment of additional public health and air quality needs, given, we above mentioned that there have been studies done. And I think the way over time this has evolved, maybe because others disagree with me and want it this way, is that it presumes the monitoring must occur and the immediacy has been put there. Like if it were me, I'd probably say something more like, assess as soon as possible the, scope or need for additional public health and air monitoring that must occur around. So anyway, I think this might be one of those places where the edits over time have shifted the meaning. Or we might have a fundamental disagreement as to what's needed here. I don't know, but that's my comment.
I mean, what we could say, Liz, I'm not sure if this works, but we could just say 7 could just say additional public health and air quality monitoring must occur in and around the neighborhoods, so on. And then what we could say is relevant state agencies should be engaged immediately in the design and implementation of. So we move the timing down to that other.
Yeah, I think you're not engaged on my point. I think that's fine if that's where others want to be. My point was that I think we all agree that assessing what needs to be done should occur right away. The way this is written, it's presuming that additional monitoring is required immediately, as opposed to having, again, Department of Health look at the studies that have been done, determine whether more is needed, and as soon as possible, making that determination. So there's a substantive difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying.
I gotcha.
Yeah, I don't know what the basis for the need for additional study is. It may very well be, but other than that being the opinion of certain task members, I don't know that we've heard that is in fact necessary. So kind of having that question answered first by these experts immediately, and then if it is necessary to certainly move forward with it, seems like the appropriate order.
I just want to raise one point for you to consider, and just for deliberation, and I'll go to Richard and Chase. I do, having done a number of these kinds of air quality monitoring location cases before, not in Vermont, there is sometimes a disagreement between the state agencies and the community about how, where, and when those air monitoring stations could take place. So even though the experts may have an opinion, the community might have a different one, and that is the resolution that often needs to take place. So I just want to emphasize that, at least in my previous experience on multiple air quality cases, that's often the negotiation is exactly where, when, and how to put monitors, because there's not an agreement between the experts and the community. Richard.
Yeah, again, I'm speaking without any knowledge specifically about the Vermont Department of Health. I'm thinking of myself in my role in other state health departments. I would be unhappy to have a group like ours say that additional public health monitoring must occur without my agency having had some say in the development of that position.
Richard, do you have a thought?
That's pretty much exactly the way I was viewing it. I'm with Richard fully on that one, just in terms of phrasing.
So Liz, I wonder about your point, whether we kind of, this has been over, it's taken a certain direction, just lots of editing. So Richard, do you have thoughts about how we could, to that point, we could address the language to address your point, and maybe Liz's too?
I mean, it's not so much changing the language here, it's actually engaging the Vermont Department of Health that I'm concerned about. If Jane could tell me that, yes, she's talked to the environmental epidemiology unit at the Vermont Department of Health and they're aware of this, they've had an opportunity to make comment, then I'd be happy.
Jane, and Jane, can you answer the question Richard just posed?
If I've asked them specifically if they want to continue to advance air mines, I have not asked Jared that. I mean, obviously Jared's been engaged in these conversations, but I haven't spoken to him specifically about that.
When you say Jared, you mean Jared Ulmer?
Yeah, sorry, just since he was the one who came and presented. But I haven't, and I know he's not the person you're referring to. Sorry, Richard.
I'm sure that Jared Ulmer's position would be located close to where the environmental epidemiology section is located in the health department, if it's typical of other health departments. Just thinking of myself as a manager of a unit that already has a full plate, that has, the environmental epidemiologist and the Vermont Department of Health, and I'm sure are not sitting around wondering what they're going to do next. They have a list of priorities, the things that they've been asked to do, and this is one more thing they're being asked to do. And if I were them, I'd want to have at least an opportunity to shape what that was.
Chase.
I think that the same canon should be said about the folks who live adjacent to the facility. We haven't engaged adequately with folks who live near the McNeil facility, who breathe the air that is emitted from the smokestacks there. And so I think if we are contemplating changes that would give some people, whether the Department of Health or others, the ability to shape what the study would be, we need to then also include the people who are in fact impacted by the decisions that are made by those agencies or those people. And so I just want to make sure that we don't lose track of that. The impacted folks, their voices haven't been heard yet in this process. And if we're contemplating a study that is going to determine the quality of the air that they breathe, they too should be part of the conversation and the planning process. And I think this harkens back to what you mentioned a moment ago, Patrick, that oftentimes there's disagreement between the community itself that's impacted by decisions and the government agencies that are making the decisions, and around the scope or how or when or if studies do occur. And so I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the real goal here, which is to make the air cleaner and the public health better for the people who live adjacent to McNeil, and just make sure that if we really are honoring that goal, that we include the voices and the people who are impacted by the decision. So to the extent we are adding additional players in here, I just would propose that we have symmetry and that we add in, a requirement that this occurs in conjunction with the outreach and the engagement above, and that outreach and engagement result in input into these types of policies and studies.
Richard. Richard, go ahead.
I wanted to remind you all of something that I said when we were all together a few weeks ago in Burlington, that doing health studies that give definitive answers is really hard, particularly when the population size is small. And the population at risk is at risk in multiple other ways in addition to the one you're interested in. So it's fairly likely that a study of health impacts would have an inconclusive result. I just think that you all should be prepared for that. I mean, again, I don't know what the environmental epidemiology unit of the Vermont Department of Health will say, but when populations are small, it can be very hard. It can be very hard to show that there's an effect, even when there is one.
Judy.
Richard, what do you consider a small population?
Well, small is relative to the size of the effect that you want to be able to measure. So, often questions like this come up from communities which have, say, 200 or 250 people, and that's just a very small population to do an epidemiologic study. A couple thousand would be much easier to work with. So, if the area of interest is just a small neighborhood with 200 or 300 people, it's just really hard to make scientific conclusions, even when there's a real effect.
But I think if you're considering adjacent people that are adjacent, you're looking at the old North End and you're looking at Winooski and you're looking at those on the hill section when the wind blows up.
Yeah, and so if you get up to 3,000 or 4,000 people, then it gets easier to detect an effect. But more of the people live farther away from the point source. The farther away you live from the point source, on the average, the less your exposure. So there's a trade-off. I'm just reflecting that these things can be hard to do well.
This does not address Richard's caution, but I do have some thoughts on language here that might work. Do you want me to give it a try, or do we want to have someone else? I'm happy if someone else has another approach to this. I have a thought of how we could maybe do this. All right, so here's one thought is, again, this may not be quite right, but if we maybe we might have to strike the first sentence, and then what we'd have is the relevant state agencies, essentially Climate Division, Department of Health, and adjacent communities. So we'd add the and adjacent communities should be engaged immediately in the consideration of the design and implementation of any targeted air monitoring. And you might want to targeted air and public health monitoring. You might want to add public health back in, because we would lost it otherwise. In the consideration of, and it'd be immediately in the consideration of the design and implementation of any targeted air monitoring and public health studies, or targeted air and public health monitoring, however you want to do it. And sorry, Jane, consideration goes in front of design, because the concern is we want to consider it first. And so consideration of the design and implementation of any targeted air and public health monitoring, or maybe public health studies, however you want to do it. Yeah. And then the next sentence is what it is. Richard.
To circle back, I'm sorry, you're more likely to get a definitive answer from air monitoring than you are from human health studies in the short run.
That, Richard, and I think that that's my understanding as well. Do you want to put something in this paragraph about that, or you want to just note that to the group?
I think we can keep working with the language the way it is. I just wanted to bring out that the part about air monitoring is really important.
Yeah. Okay. Good. All right. How does this paragraph as revised look to try to account for the viewpoints expressed, Chase?
Could we please, in the first sentence, add adjacent communities?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. So it should be public health and adjacent communities. Thank you. Thanks, Chase, for catching that. Richard. Oh, Richard, you all set?
Yep.
All right, so how does this sentence now look? Or this paragraph, sorry, number 7. Chase.
This is I guess, a question, and I'm deferring to you on this, Richard, since this is your area of expertise. Should it be noted in here that this type of study may not provide definitive answers, just so that the potential impact of this study is in sort of the proper context?
I mean, Richard, if you wanted to draft, we could even footnote that to Chase's point, the public health study piece. And then Richard, if you gave us the footnote to describe it accurately, technically, we could add that in.
Okay, I can do that. I just want to add one more caveat, and I'm sorry that I'm not presenting this all at once in a coherent way, but when you get inconclusive study results from a health study, the people in the community say, well, you know, the study wasn't done well enough or it wasn't big enough, and we still know there's a health effect. And the people that can make money off the pollution say, see, there's no effect. And they confound inconclusive with no effect. So there's actually some danger to a community that is impacted by a point source of pollution that an inconclusive study result can be seized upon by people who want to continue the status quo to say, see, there's no problem.
That's my concern too, Richard, and why I was asking whether or not we ought to sort of place this type of research into context, the context that you described, that it may end up being inconclusive because of the sample size of the population we're working with or other limitations in the modeling. And I agree that that's the sort of dynamic we wouldn't want to occur.
And so I wonder if, again, if a caveat and a footnote on the public health studies, which Richard could help us draft, might be in order here to put those appropriate conditions or cautions, so to speak.
I'll give you 3 or 4. I will give you 3 or 4 sentences, and I'm not going to do it in real time while we're talking here.
No expectation of that. That's totally fine, Richard. We'll only make Jane write it in real time. Totally fair. Okay, so I think what we need to go back is Chase's point, though. So we need to go back to that last sentence of number 6, once Jane's able to type this in, so that we can look at number 6, that last sentence, because Chase had raised a point about that.
Just for your awareness, I still have a question about 5, so it'd be good to reserve a couple minutes for that.
Sure. Let me go to finish 6 and we'll go back to 5, Billy, no problem. Okay, number 6. Right. So Chase, I think you were suggesting move this. I think moving that up to kind of the overall study studies that we described in number 3. Is that right, Chase? So it feels like it's a little bit distinct from the engagement point that the rest of the paragraph actually makes.
Exactly.
Okay.
I don't feel particularly strong about that. It just seems to me like that kind of change would make sense if the rest of the group is amenable to it.
I mean, we wouldn't be referencing 3. We're just putting it up in 3. Anybody have a concern about moving that to just as a bullet under number 3?
I have a concern about about the commas in that sentence.
Say more.
Adverse impacts to public health from particulate matter. We don't mean adverse effects to public health from quality of life or from cultural resources. So maybe an "and" in front of quality of life would handle my problem.
Yeah, and I think you want to add the word impacts too. So and impacts to quality of life and cultural resources should be. I think you're right. Otherwise, it's weirdly worded. Yeah, great. Good catch. All right, anybody, given with that improvement, thanks, Richard. Any concerns about moving that up just as a sub bullet under number 3 rather than a reference to number 3? Okay, if I'm not hearing anybody concerns, I think Jane's going to move it up. And then in the second here, Billy, we'll go to number 5. let's go to number 5 if we could. Up the it's good. Good point. We don't need to put that anymore. Period. Okay. All right. Number 5. All right, Billy, you got a question?
Sorry, on the last, excuse me, the last sentence of that, the task group also recommends that the life cycle assessment provides sensitivity analysis, blah, blah, blah. So I know we discussed this a little bit last week. I don't exactly know what that means, right? Like, what are the timelines required? There's targets for emissions reductions in the GWSA that are tied to those dates. So they're not really timelines. And then any change in the analysis is going to require a revision to the baseline levels in the GWSA. So I feel like there's probably value in being explicit there. And I just don't know if that's people's intent. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that because I didn't feel like we concluded that conversation. I don't recall how we concluded it last time.
Give Jane a minute to play with some language here.
Sorry, and I was just going to clarify that I wasn't trying to address Billy's comment, but I don't think that we should say the task group recommends in a recommendation. So it's just changing the language to address that it would be the state to do that. So hope that
first,
makes sense to everybody.
All right, Jane. So Charlie, go ahead.
Oh, I just had a question as to whether a sensitivity analysis is that a commonly used type of analysis, or are we coining that term? I just wanted to be clear as to, like, if we say conduct a sensitivity analysis, does that mean something to the people that do this kind of work, or are we just saying conduct an analysis around the sensitivity of the situation? I just don't know the word choice.
Hopefully Colin's still here. It is an actual term. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say exactly, Jane. I was saying, Colin, if you're able to, do you have any thoughts on this paragraph to make it clearer and more precise, as I think Billy's asking for?
I will comment on the sensitivity analysis first, and that yes, that's a commonly used kind of way to evaluate maybe different variables or scenarios, and so yes, I think that will be understood. Let me take a little bit closer look at that last sentence here. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's probably interesting information to have in terms of life cycle emissions around those, but honestly, I don't know, like, you're going to run into all the issues that this group has already kind of run into with that, even with that answer. And so I don't think it's going to be a kind of a straightforward answer, a straightforward number. If you get the life cycle number out of any of that, it's going to be caveated like all of this stuff is caveated. So I'm not necessarily against it. I think Billy is also correct, and I don't know exactly how it interacts with the actual GWSA kind of mandated levels. Because the inventory right now is not on a life cycle basis. And so, yeah, I guess, sorry, I don't really have a totally clear answer for that, but I guess that's kind of my thoughts in looking at that sentence.
Okay. Adam.
I just want to say that I don't support this recommendation, at least the first sentence, because it does nothing to explain the possible double counting issue. And I think it's, as written, misleading, and it doesn't actually provide any clear recommendation of how to account for emissions at the point of combustion without running into the double counting issue. And secondly, the literature that has advocated for this approach has been for international movement of biofuels from like one country to another, and it has only been advocated in that vein, and I don't think it's appropriate at a state level to use that approach. So like, if this is the consensus for other folks, that's fine, but like, I just want to go on record that I do not support number 5.
And Adam, I'm not sure to parse the last two things you said. So if you're not okay with 5, and yet would you say stand aside, or are you saying that you're not okay with number 5? So I think consensus is either you don't. Yeah.
Go let the group go ahead with it, but I just want to go on record that I do not support that, because I think it only confuses it and does not make anything clearer, and that the council is not equipped to like understand the circumstances and the implications from what's written here.
Chase and then Richard.
I guess I would just say that my understanding of the literature on greenhouse gas emissions accounting in this space from biogenic sources is that it is evolving because of a recognition that the older way of doing things from the 1990s that we've been using, where we account for combustion emissions in the land use sector, is in fact undercounting emissions, and that the data that we're relying upon is problematic, far from perfect, and that as a result we're getting pretty rough and problematic greenhouse gas emissions accounting numbers out of that system. And what my understanding is that the literature on this is not just about international accounting, but it is starting there, because the sort of foil, the proposal that you've put forward, Adam, about the accounting that should be used from the IPCC is itself global. And so this alternative is being presented as we should replace the IPCC's current methodology with this methodology. But of course, the IPCC's methodology then filters down to the country and the state level, where they implement the same type of accounting. And the idea is that that's what would occur with this as well. It's sort of just a different paradigm that's intended to accurately account for emissions, avoid undercounting. And so I understand sort of where you're coming from. I just think that we should be clear about if this were implemented, it would not involve double counting, because the emissions from the energy sector would be counted separately from what's going on in the land use sector. There wouldn't, there could be consistency at all levels of accounting, local, national, and international. And so I guess I just would want to have sort of a conversation around it that sort of avoided things like words like misleading or things like that, because I don't think that that's really what this is. I think hard-nosed scientists from around the globe are considering this sincerely. And so I think we should just sort of speak about it in that way if possible.
Richard.
I'm pretty much agree with everything just said. We've just yesterday finished our Addison County greenhouse gas inventory. We're ready to publish, and we had to do something with the burning of wood for heat, and assessing how much wood is removed from Addison County's forests is, first of all, that information is not available, and secondly, it wouldn't really address the question of how much greenhouse gas we are emitting from heating our houses with wood, some of us. That's just a comment about where I'm at with this, but don't we have a contract pending from somebody who is going to do a life cycle assessment of all of our energy sources? Is this not going to be included in that contract, this topic?
Yes, we do, and it will.
So I'm not sure what we do by including number 5, or is it just say, we're waiting for the results of that contract to.
I think that would be a perfectly good approach, is to just say, like, let's see the results of that. I think the issue of this is that I actually agree, Richard, with the approach that you've taken with the GPW, GWP, bio
Yeah.
approach. I think that's good. And actually accounting at the point of combustion is good. And a lot of the science is already doing that for the non-biogenic GHG emissions of, methane and N2O. But I think if just with that statement, it's very vague and it's non-specific. So if someone just says, all right, well, we're going to do that, and that's the gross emissions as measured at the stack of CO2 for the full biogenic, and there's not some sort of discounted method, like the number 5. So I don't disagree with what people are saying. I'm just saying it's so incredibly vague that it could be taken the wrong way.
I mean, could we, I'm not sure about the language. Could we say something a little bit different on number 5, that essentially says the state, when assessing GHG emissions for biomass, essentially take into account the evolving and latest science on these matters? I mean, that's kind of vague, but you would hint at it without trying to be specific at this point. Chase.
What if we changed at the beginning of the first sentence of 5 to say the state should investigate whether to? And so then we're not saying directly right now, change the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but rather contemplate how to do so. And I guess one thing that I'm thinking about is that the second sentence there, which pertains to sequestration, the number from that, when compared to the number from the first sentence about gross emissions, should then provide the full context of emissions out and storage in. And so we would, I think, in fact, get that sort of sensitivity that a GWP bio otherwise provides. You just have to compare the 2 columns side by side to do that. But you would, in fact,
have that in the carbon budget that was produced for the Climate Council. It looks at the emissions from the land use sector, assuming kind of anything that was harvested was combusted or otherwise is an emitter, and then it looks at sequestration and storage. So I thought that's exactly what the carbon budget did.
No, that's a little different. This is, you would look at the actual combustion, say that was happening in Holmes and at McNeil and at Reigate, and you would determine the greenhouse gas emissions out from there. And that'd be in one column. And then in another column, you would look at the total amount of carbon stored in forests, for example. And then you'd have 2 numbers. Basically, you'd have the debits and the credits, and then you could determine the ultimate balance from that. So it's a little different. You don't make like assumptions about wood being harvested and it all being combusted. You'd rather sort of look at the actual emissions in the energy sector, the thermal sector, and do it in that way.
Colin should speak to this, but we do that now. It's shown as an appendix in the greenhouse gas inventory, that gross emission total from what you're referencing, Chase. And so if I understand that correctly, because we have the number, I mean, of the gross emissions from burning of wood in homes and electricity, and that is, about 2 million metric tons annually. And it's just not in the front in the inventory, it's in the back, but Colin does calculate that. And the sequestration number was the carbon budget. That was the first time that we had tried to do it comprehensively for the state.
Yeah, I can just, sorry, Pat.
No, go for it. Go for it.
I can just add on that. Some of that information is in there as you all are referencing. I guess I would just kind of caveat that with the data that informs all of those estimates is not particularly solid. So like we don't have a great estimate of the amount of wood that is burned in houses in Vermont. We have a survey that Forest Parks and Rec does every several years now that gives a pretty good idea, but it's not a gigantic sample size. And so it's something, but it's a little bit variable through the years. And the same is kind of true with coming up with the sequestration numbers. Chase kind of referenced at least part of that science is evolving and people are trying to come up with good ways to do that. But but trying to come up with kind of an annual land use change on the level of granularity that you then use to kind of inform how much sequestration you have had in a particular year. It's not straightforward, and there are a lot of details in it. And so it is all evolving, and those numbers are in there, but we're hoping to improve them as much as we can going forward. But there's a long way to go. This sector has not gotten a whole lot of attention until the last probably 2 years. And people are really starting to pay a lot more attention to it, and trying to get kind of better spatial data and better tools to analyze this, and using LiDAR to kind of analyze your carbon stocks. But having to do that every year is very data intensive, and so is probably going to require a regional effort, honestly, just to have the resources to do that.
I'm aware we're past time for public comment, so let me take the 2 hands that are up, and then we probably need to pause for public comment and then kind of see where we are. So Chase, over to you, then to Richard.
Sorry, that's an old hand.
Okay, Richard.
I'm still not sure why we need paragraph 5 at all, given that we have a process already in place.
And so one option is to revise it. One option is to strike it, Richard, to your point. So let me take public comment, and we'll come right back to the point you just made. I want to take a break now for public comment. And if anybody wants to make a public comment, just raise your hand, introduce yourself, and we'll hear your public comment. Anybody want to make a public comment at this time? Okay, Cheryl Joy made her comment. So strike it. Okay, so let's pick back up Richard's comment. So let's see. So would anyone word this right? Does anyone disagree with striking number 5 and just being done with it? Chase.
Yeah, I think I do. Only in that when one reads the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, the number that one gets when looking at emissions for, say, the electricity sector or the thermal sector right now does not reflect emissions from combusting wood. And so when we think as a state about the total emissions that we need to reduce to achieve the greenhouse gas emission requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act, we are starting with a number that is, I would say, artificially low. And that's harmful for us to be able to achieve those targets in an accurate, transparent, and meaningful way. And so I would suggest that we have at least a sensitivity that demonstrates what the emissions from combusting wood are, whether that makes it into the final, gross emissions calculation, which currently uses the assumptions that Adam has spoken about that assume that wood is, net zero CO2, is sort of a different question. But at the very least, a sensitivity where there's a box somewhere in the inventory that shows here are the gross emissions, and then next to that, a sensitivity that shows here are the life cycle emissions. Then I think at the very least, we as a state will be equipped with the different data to help inform us about the policy decisions that we make, so that we don't, for example, go down one path thinking that it is a climate solution when in fact it would result in maintaining status quo emissions levels, or perhaps even increasing emissions levels, simply because it's almost 2023 and we only have a handful of years left to get this right. And so I think that more information to inform our decisions is a good thing.
Richard, and then Carl.
Yeah, there is value in addressing this issue here. I just think that, and so I don't necessarily want to remove number 5 entirely, even though I said that a moment ago. But what I do want is to reflect in our document that we have a process in place that could result in an answer to these questions fairly soon. So we need to make sure that the contractor who has been chosen for the life cycle contract addresses the issues that we think are important, which are here in this paragraph.
Let me go to Colin and Judy, and then I want to figure out what we're going to do with language here. So Colin.
Sure, thanks. Just gonna speak to the greenhouse gas inventory a little bit, and that, Chase, I totally appreciate that. In terms of the life cycle analysis, I will say I'm not against putting those numbers in there. That life cycle analysis is not going to be completed before the next inventory comes out. That being said, when the life cycle inventory does come out, I certainly have no problem with kind of incorporating that information as a sensitivity in there. And I am planning on kind of structuring the inventory in a way that's a little different this iteration, where I'm hoping to put, or where I'm planning to put, kind of that at the stack emission total for wood in there, and it will not be kind of included in the gross total as you mentioned, but it will be there as a point of reference to say, if you did include this, and this is a topic that is up for debate right now, obviously, as we've been talking about for months, but if you did include it, this is what it would look like. And I also, just in terms of including it or not, it does, Billy kind of made this point a little bit earlier, where it is also not included in the 1990 total. So that would also go up, which would just kind of adjust everything, which is not necessarily bad, but I honestly don't know where that leaves us in terms of meeting different targets, et cetera. So yeah, just wanted to throw that out there, that I am planning to make it more kind of front and center, if you will, in that thermal or electric, where it applies sector. So it's available for people to see.
Judy.
I think we should keep number 5 in, just to keep it on people's minds, because the date of when the life cycle analysis report will be done has changed several times because of obstacles that Jane had to overcome. And I think, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, the last meeting you said the report won't even be done until like the beginning of summer or something like that next year. So at least it keeps it in people's mind, because this is going to go to the council now, not down the road.
I have one thought about language here, but Richard, over to you.
Well, as to language, we could say the state should assure that the existing contract assesses, and then continue with the rest of the paragraph.
Should assure. Let's give Jane a second to get that in there, Richard. So
that the existing life cycle contract.
Right.
And then investigates.
Adam, after you.
Yeah, this is kind of nitpicky, but second sentence, it should be just carbon sequestration. I mean, we emit GHGs, but we sequester carbon.
Right, we don't. Good point. All right, so how does, I want to see how that looks. Billy, did that, given the conversation we just had, and the changes we made, does that address your concerns?
I still think, from what I'm hearing, I still think we should delete after GHG emissions in the last sentence. So delete relevant to the 2050 targets required by GWSA. I'm fine having a recommendation that there be a sensitivity analysis. I don't think there's a tie back to the GWSA targets, given that it's based on a different methodology. So I think that second sentence is fine if you just get rid of the Well, that part.
Chase, do you have any concern about striking that last clause?
Well, I don't think that, I mean, I don't think that distinction that that Billy articulated is necessarily wrong, that the GWSA emissions reduction requirements may or may not be tied to life cycle emissions. But I think if you actually look at the language in 10 VSA section 582G, it says that we need to have a life cycle measure. And that language is old at this point, 10 years old. It predates the Global Warming Solutions Act by a number of years. And so, you know, although the state hasn't done that yet, Billy, I think you're right. I do think that that language, which is then incorporated into the Global Warming Solutions Act in 10 VSA section 578A, which references the emissions inventory, including that life cycle language in subsection G, I think it is all bound up together. And so, you know, frankly, I do think it's relevant to meeting the 2025 30 and 50 targets. I think the legislature has said so. I think it's in the statutes. I think, you know, I think it's all there. So I guess I just don't really understand why we would delete it, but without even getting into the sort of like nitpicky details about what the statutes say and what the legislature has directed, I guess I just, from a practical perspective, I don't know why we would delete it.
Yeah, my only point is that those targets all flow from a baseline that did not track emissions in the way that we're suggesting be tracked in this recommendation. So there, it's apples to oranges, right? You can't, it's irrelevant data as compared to the targets in the GWSA, because they turn on a baseline that did not track emissions in this way. So that's my only point. It's just, you're going to compare an analysis to a baseline that was not done with the same methodology.
Maybe.
Yeah, I guess that's just where I don't really think that that's necessarily true. 10 VSA 578A references the greenhouse gas emissions inventory in 582, which includes in subsection G a life cycle assessment. And so I don't think that that's right, Billy. I think that the life cycle assessment hasn't happened yet, but it's been required for, you know, about a decade, and it just hasn't happened yet. So I guess I just don't agree as a matter of law on that.
So Chase, I wonder, for purposes of completing the language, whether if we are silent on the matter, you all can debate elsewhere, I think.
And I'm fine if we want to put some caveat that says those targets as calculated through a similar life cycle, you know, a similar life cycle analysis, something like that. I don't care if they're in there. I just want to be clear that the numbers that we're using right now need to be adjusted. The baselines we're using now need to be adjusted if we're going to compare it to a life cycle analysis. That's my only point.
Jane, what Billy just suggested, do you want to try to put that in? So I think we're going to put something about targets, but with the caveat Bill you said, which, so let's give Jane a second to see if she can craft that. Billy, does that capture your point?
I don't know if that's accurate exactly, but Colin should speak up to how to reflect that too. And Billy, feel free if you have a suggestion.
As adjusted, I think I would put by the GWSA as adjusted through a similar life cycle analysis. I don't know. I guess none of this really matters, but it seems misleading to say that we could just compare the current baseline to this new analysis, because it's not the same.
Colin, do you have any language for precision here that would help us kind of close this up?
Sorry, I'm thinking about it a little bit. I agree with what Billy is saying in terms of like the current, and this is kind of what I was saying before, is that the current 1990 value is not a life cycle value. And so it's very true that if you just applied those life cycle factors to the most current data and compared that to your 1990 that would be apples to oranges. I think that's Billy's point. So whether, I don't honestly know if that factor could be applied to the activity data we have for 1990. It could be that it would be as easy as doing that and saying like, okay, well, we have factors for this, but a lot of those factors also depend on kind of the processes that go into, say, harvesting that wood or managing the forest, et cetera. And I don't know if we have that data for 1990. So I'm not sure how that comparison would end up working. And I know that doesn't answer your question on the text, but I just want to point that out first, in that we would need to adjust 1990. We could make, I think, probably some reasonable assumptions to do that. But I think it's unlikely we'd be able to just kind of plug and play the factors that we're going to come up with for the current practices back 30 years.
Chase, do you have a thought on language?
I do, yeah. I'm wondering if perhaps we can avoid a lot of this, because the distinctions that are being made about apples and oranges here between gross and life cycle emissions are good observations. What if we were to say, after the words GHG emissions, something like to help inform progress towards meeting or progress in meeting the 2025, 2030, and 2050 targets required by the GWSA, and then strike all of the language that follows that, given that to help inform is sort of a nod to the fact that this would be a sensitivity analysis, which I think is what we've been contemplating. And then we're not considering like full scale, at least not at this moment, considering full scale, kiboshing the gross emissions calculation, replacing it with a life cycle emissions calculation. Does that thread the needle, Billy, Colin?
And Jane, just to be clear, Chase, to you, I think what we just said to inform progress, and after that last GWSA, we put period, right? And we just end the paragraph there.
Yeah, I have it highlighted. That would be what would be deleted, but
Okay.
Not deleting it yet.
No, very
So
sensible.
everybody-
How does that sound to Billy and Colin if we put it that way? Billy?
I think that's fine. Yeah, sounds fine to me too. Thanks.
All right, let's do it. All right, okay. Richard.
Could you give me permission to share my screen for a moment?
You should have access if I stop sharing. Go for it. I'm going to use this moment, this break, to run away
so
for one
this
second.
is
No problem. Go for it, Jane.
This is one graphic from the just completed Addison County greenhouse gas inventory. The far left-hand pair of bars are what you would show if you followed the current approach in the state inventory of just showing the CO2 equivalent emissions from methane and from nitrous oxide. The large bars, the second to left set of bars, is the total CO2 emissions from burning the wood, not making any allowance for sequestration or replacement of the wood, treating it the same way you would treat coal. The third set of bars is what you get when you apply the GWP bio, the global warming potential of 0.35 that we used. So it's about 1/3 the size. That just gives you an idea of the relative magnitudes in one county of doing the analysis 3 different ways. I just wanted to show you that. The 2 bars on the right show you that Middlebury College that heats its buildings largely with wood and with wood chips, and is a significant contributor to the county total, but it's not the whole story. Just wanted to show you.
Okay, no, that's Richard. That's really helpful. Thank you. That was actually a very specific example, which is super helpful. Okay, Jane, let's give Jane a minute to come back. I think I want to kind of see if we're looking like we've kind of finessed 5 to satisfaction. I think we need to come back to the first paragraph there. I guess on number 3. So let me just see if Jane's returned yet, and then we'll do a check-in where we're at here after that. Let's give Jane a minute. Why don't we do this? Why don't we give everybody like a 2-minute break? So if people want to grab some water, a quick bio break, which I might, Jane, we're just going to take a quick break for everybody. So we'll be back in 3.
Okay.
Okay.
I had to do the bio break.
You know, I need one too, so no problem.
Mhm. Resume recording. Sorry, there you go. You want to go back to the doc?
Yeah, let's go back to that number. I think we'd had those two options for, I think, was it number 3? Okay, so again, I think this is where we were. I don't know that any of us have any ideas to how to bridge the difference other than having both in. So just a final chance if people have any brilliant ideas for weaving this together. And if not, we'll maybe need to leave both stand, but just want to give the group a final chance if there's something else we can do with this section. Any additional ideas other than to have both in? Okay. So I think
I have a question, Patrick.
sure, Judy, go for it.
A long time ago, when we all started this, we got a list of which biomass centers were putting out the most CO2, and the chart Richard just showed made me think of it. I think the third one on the list was Middlebury. And so should we have the number 2 in there, or should we say Vermont's existing biomass electric facilities?
Does Middlebury just do heat?
Yes.
Mhm.
It's primarily heat.
Okay,
There is a small amount of electrical generation, but it's behind the meter. It does also cooling as well as heat.
I was just wondering if we should be as limiting by saying 2 or saying McNeil and Reigate.
Judy, Jane, could you go to the top of that one here, just we can look at number 3. Thank you.
I believe the scope of our group is on electric-led biomass.
Right, but didn't you just say that they do some electrical?
Adam,
Electric-led, I think it's thermal-led.
Thermal lead versus electric.
It's for their own use. They don't supply electricity to the grid.
But they supply their own electricity?
Some of their own.
There are a
So,
number of combined heat and power plants in Vermont. They aren't captured in our scope. Middlebury is one of them, but there's a number of them.
right, I saw that on the list a long time ago, but there were 3 that particularly stuck out, McNeil, Reigate, and Middlebury, as being high people of plants that had a high greenhouse gas emission.
And I think I'm wondering what other folks think, given that there are a number of other entities that do produce primarily thermal, Middlebury maybe being the biggest, but others, whether we let this sit for now as is, given our scope, or try to do something different at the 11th hour here. Anybody, I mean, I think probably going to be, I don't know, other people have a view on this.
I would leave it as is.
Anybody else?
Leave it as is.
We do capture some broad conversation about thermal that, further below that, certainly raises up the issue around the accounting 1, and then 2, just thermal generally and effect on forests and the like. So
I will just add from what I understand of Middlebury College, they are, where they can, as they renovate their buildings, they are switching over to electric heat pumps. Not all their buildings are suitable for that, but they are gradually heating more with electric heat pumps and less with wood pellets as they renovate their buildings. They're leaving the wood pellet infrastructure in place. It's already there. It's a sunk cost. They've already got the steam tunnels. The building that was most recently renovated has the steam from the wood burning plant as the backup for the heat pumps. But they're not. But the next building they do, they're going to heat from their pellet plant because it's not suitable for, they say, for electric heat pumps. In Middlebury College's own accounting, they point to the thousands of acres of forest that they own in the Green Mountains that they're not harvesting, and where wood is being sequestered as a reason why they shouldn't be held responsible for the CO2 emissions from their wood chip burning, even though their wood chips they're burning are actually not from their forest, they're from elsewhere.
Okay. So I want to take a step back to the document as a whole. I think the group has worked really hard and constructively over the last many meetings to try to arrive at a set of recommendations they can put forward to the Climate Council. We'll talk a little bit about the subcommittee role in a second. So I think the question now is, I think we need to kind of decide whether we're ready to move these forward to the Climate Council with a step to the subcommittees for conversation and understanding. I think Jane can explain in a minute. Charlie.
Thanks. At the risk of prolonging the editing process, I just had two other things where I noted, and I apologize for not being here at the last meeting to bring these up, but hopefully they're kind of minor. I don't know if you want to bring the document back up or what, but yep, on the second bullet, just for clarity, I don't think the plants, unless I misunderstand, I don't think the plants are actually permitted for the volume of biomass they're using. And so just to be clear, the second sentence there, I don't know, should we switch that to furthermore, the facility should strive to increase efficiency? I just said to say that they should use less biomass than they're currently permitted. I don't think that actually is an accurate statement, right? Like they're not permitted to.
Charlie, could you say something like that they're currently using? Because that would be more accurate. I don't know if that's right or not.
Sure. Either way, I don't think they're currently permitted for a specific volume. So I think the goal here is to increase efficiency, which would be reducing material inputs, and there is an efficiency angle here, you know. But I don't think saying they should use less than currently permitted is really an accurate statement.
Aren't they permitted for a specific size? Like so many miles from where they are?
There's different ways that they account for the radius of where they're bringing the material. I don't know specifically if there's a limit to the radius, but I think this is getting at volume, I think. I mean, from my perspective, it seems like the second sentence is around increasing efficiency. So, I mean, I would recommend just saying, furthermore, they should strive to increase efficiency. But happy to.
How about the language that we just put forward? I think Jane's working on some. Give Jane a second and let's look at it. I'm also aware of the time, so I want to be pretty efficient. And I think if we can arrive on language without much debate, that would be good. If we can't, we can't. Liz.
Subject to seeing how Jane is typing that sentence, that seems good and an improvement. I did want to just state, and this is something I said many meetings ago, but just want to say here, since we're bringing up number 2, I did not join in the agreement or consensus on the first sentence here. And the reasons, just to be clear for the record, as it were, is because expanded is not defined. And the phrase physically or otherwise, I think while it's, making an attempt at some sort of definition, to me is vague. And to be very clear, I believe the plants should have an opportunity to expand usage type, like the district energy that's discussed further below with regard to McNeil, and like some of the ideas I've heard Rygate bring up at the legislature in terms of cogeneration or other uses. So I'm happy to just have that out there. I can make sure the Climate Council understands that when it comes up, but wanted to make it clear here.
And Liz, in a second, I'll want to kind of test where we are generally and how to, and try to carefully phrase how I say that to the point you just made. Chase, I think you're next, then back to Charlie.
Thanks. I think that the suggestion that you proposed, Patrick, about perhaps changing the word permitted to use without introducing the word efficiency would be my preferred course of action. Since I think the goal there, Charlie's right, is about volume, and the word efficiency becomes a bit loaded because then that sort of insinuates that cogeneration would be sort of one of the goals here, which for an aging facility, as we've highlighted, might really just be a situation in which we establish a thermal option that then loses its ability to be truly cogeneration and become something different. And so biomass, so I think looking at that language, use less biomass than they currently do. Than they do currently. Yeah, I think that would be fine, but I'm curious to hear what Charlie has to say.
Charlie.
I'd set efficiency because in my brain, the way to create the same amount of power using less inputs would be to increase efficiency. That's why I offered efficiency, but either way, I mean, I think we can move on from this. I just think the permitting thing was my main point.
Good, let's move on then, Charlie. Let's go to the next one.
Go ahead, Billy, sorry.
I think we spent a lot of time on this one at some point in the past and concluded that using what they currently use as a standard is flawed because use fluctuates greatly from year to year, etc. So, but I don't have an opinion about this, just sharing that we did have that conversation, and that's where we concluded not to use that in the past. Okay. But I think it conveys the intent, so it's fine by me.
Yeah.
Charlie.
The only other one that I thought was a little problematic is just the last sentence in number 4. Just because it kind of contradicts itself a little bit. It says additionally representation outside of state government and the Climate Council process. So the Climate Council process does include representation from outside government. So that is kind of contradictory there. And then if we're asking for a process outside of the Climate Council, I don't understand how that relates to the rest of this because it's a recommendation to the council to form a new task group. So I would just strike that whole last sentence. And if there's something about diverse representation, you could plug it into the new task group language above. But I just think that last sentence is just kind of contradictory.
Let's let Jane take a crack at this. Strike then, and Jane, you want to just highlight the diverse representation as we can see the language you added there. So what about that, Charlie? Is that me?
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. My main point was just the last sentence I think needed to go because it kind of contradicted the rest of the paragraph.
Okay. Any other comments or considerations given that edit? Charlie, does anybody have any other additional changes or suggestions or concerns about 4 as reworded? Okay. So I think if there's no further comments, I think to Liz's point, I think people have worked hard. And I think they've done their best to kind of accommodate and address people's, other concerns and issues as we ask you to do. And Bill, I have a hard stop at 10:32. So I think the question is this ready? Well, Jane, maybe I stop for a second. Jane, talk about what you were thinking about the subcommittee process vis-a-vis the Vermont Climate Council in this document.
I want to stop sharing, but I just want to note that I added this word overall to sort of reflect the variation over timescales that Billy related to, and just want to make sure that feels appropriate before I close the doc.
Right.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So the impression that I had really when we invited subcommittee members into the conversation last time is that where small tweaks were appropriate, that's one thing. But what I want to test with all of you is that I feel like this task group was intended to represent the diversity across the subcommittees. And while I appreciate that we should have another meeting with subcommittee members invited in, what I really see that is a learning exchange where you all can really try to communicate the thought process behind how you reached consensus on the way this is drafted. I only highlight that because I think that at the council meeting, when recommendations come up, there's often time constraints, challenges around really diving in. And so I think that while we should definitely build that time into the council meeting, I think adding another layer where we invite in a broad representation of subcommittee members and really focus on having counselors on other subcommittees who have not participated, who want to sort of understand and provide space to really understand how the decisions were made, have that meeting, have a discussion, the learning process, but really think of it as the recommendations are drafted the way they are to carry up to the council, minus any small tweaks that you might want to make at that meeting. But I wouldn't think of it as a redrafting of the recommendations with the subcommittees, and wanted to draw that distinction for you all to consider, just knowing that we've highlighted this with the Just Transition Subcommittee, and we're now, the next meeting should probably be a space for all 4 subcommittees to be invited, not just Ag and Eco and Cross Sector, which brings in a much bigger group. And when I sort of market that meeting to the subcommittees, really want to focus in on counselors and ask counselors who want to take a deep dive on these recommendations to join at that meeting, to have a space to do that, knowing that time feels tight when it goes to the actual council. So just want to suggest that the council meeting's on the 12th. This will be half of the agenda on that meeting. It'll be a big consideration for them, and want to offer one more meeting. And I want to suggest that that would be next Wednesday morning, if that works for you all, where we invite subcommittee members in.
So just
that's also short notice, so appreciate if that doesn't work, but there's only 2 Wednesdays between now and the next council meeting.
So once we test for where the group as a whole is today on this document, then I think, as Jane said, for certainly understanding, discussion, dialogue with the subcommittees as a whole next week or the week after, what you decide would be there. But really the intent would not be to try to further refine this document, but to really build understanding and commentary with the subcommittees, particularly the Climate Council members, and then the document would go forward to the Climate Council for consideration. Because as you all know, it's been hard work of you all to get to kind of where we are. So anybody have a concern about that kind of process as Jane laid out? Any concerns about that process? And in a second here, I think we'll get to the dates. Okay, so and maybe just on dates where we're at it. So Liz cannot make next week. Liz, could you make the following Wednesday?
Looks like it. And Jane, the purpose is it's not just this group, you'd invite the task groups. Is that the short version of who gets invited?
The subcommittees, you mean? Yeah.
That's what I mean, sorry. Task group plus subcommittees, got it. Thanks.
And we could do, Jane, how do you feel about doing that meeting on the 7th versus the 30th?
I haven't looked at my schedule, but I can make it work. I will say that I know you're unavailable, Pat, and I know that backup CBI folks are not available at 8:30. So on either next Wednesday or the following Wednesday, which I think is fine. And I think that I can facilitate it and run the meeting, which is fine.
Sorry about that. Did anybody else have a preference for dates? I think Liz prefers the following date, the 7th, not the 30th. Anybody else have a strong view of the dates?
I can't do the 30th.
Okay, Bill, I can't do the 30th. So it looks to me like the 7th. Charlie?
Yeah, I'm already committed elsewhere on both of those days, but to Liz's comment in the chat, if the document's not being updated, I'm okay not being here.
Anybody else? I'm hearing that Charlie can't make either. Liz and Billy can't make the 30th, which suggests unless otherwise I hear the 7th probably is better. Recognizing the limitations for CBI's UL, sorry, is not there that day. Okay, so Jane, I think we're looking at the 7th. Liz, you're an important link between this group and the council, so I think it would be important for you to be able to be there for sure. Okay, so I want to just test, and I want to try my phraseology out first before we test for it, which is I think the question I want to ask is this. I want to see if it's the right question before we then see what the answer is from you all. But I think the question I want to say is, do you, and I would ask each of you individually, do you consent or stand aside to let this document move forward to the Vermont Climate Council? That's the way I think I would phrase it. But if I should phrase it differently, let me know. But I was trying to figure out the right language. And then I want to test with you all where we're at with the document as a whole. Liz.
I think that's fine, so long as that same phrasing continues on as the document gets passed on. In other words, the task group, recommended this document be considered. That doesn't mean everybody agrees with every sentence therein, is the way I'm fine with that. As long as it carries through when it gets passed on.
And to that end, potentially as a statement at the beginning of it, just because where this is going to be read or seen or used, there might not be somebody there all the time to be like, hey, by the way, so if you want to put that in the beginning of it, that could be helpful.
I'm going to put this in chat to make sure it looks right to you all. So I just put in chat what I think the language is. And if we can, before I ask, I want to get the question right. So, and then we, as noted, whatever the sentences we use, then we would put it in the document up front. That look okay? Judy, I want to test with you because I know you're very thoughtful about consensus. Does that look like the right phraseology?
The question or the paper?
The question, yeah. So did I put in chat there?
Yeah, it's not stand aside, it's do you consent or do you vote to consent for the betterment of the group to move forward is what it is. Or do you agree to the document for the betterment of the group to move forward? So in other words, like I agree for the most part with the document. I'm a little concerned about the highlighted ones there where we have option 1 and option 2. But for the good of the group, I will consent to move forward.
Let's work on this language a bit. Okay, so let me try the slight modification there that Judy just noted. So I just put that in chat again. Okay, how does that look? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so Judy, that good?
Yep.
Great. Okay, so I want to then, with that phrase in chat, that last one, I want to just go through each task group member and say, yes, I consent or stand aside to allow this to move forward. So again, you can just say, if you're saying yes, you're either consenting or standing aside, but nonetheless letting it move forward.
Can I ask a quick clarifying question?
Sure.
Are we focused just on the recommendations? Because there is a separate document posted today that's an introduction. I have all sorts of concerns about that introduction. I don't think we didn't discuss it at all. So I'm not prepared for that to go forward. I think we should just focus on the recommendations.
Billy and I should be clear. Yeah, given the detail we need to go through today, we don't have the time, nor would we necessarily get to the end of that other document. So this is strictly the recommendations 1 through 7.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
Great clarification of this document. Let me actually, so it's essentially of the recommendations 1 through 7. Okay. Any other clarification before we ask? Okay. So I'm gonna ask just kind of the way my screen shows from left to right, top to bottom. So Liz, can you consent or stand aside for the good of the group to let this document move forward? Great. Chase. Okay, thumbs up. Judy. Yes. Okay, Billy,
Yes.
Adam. Okay, Charlie. Richard,
Yes.
Colin.
I don't think I'm actually a voting member, Pat, but.
Okay, you're not a member. Okay, thank you for letting me know that. Okay, so there we are. And I think what Jane, we asked is to put this caveat language at the top. So
That's the language that I'm going to put at the top of the recommendation. I just put it in the chat. Is that?
I don't think that's quite right. I think it needs to say that, the task group consented or stood aside for the good of group to let this document as a whole move forward to the Climate Council for consideration. So I don't think it's.
But nobody stood aside. So do I need to say that?
I
That was implied
Yes.
in the question.
Yes.
I think.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the important thing here is to capture the idea that there is still some potential disagreement in the language, but we're all at a point where after 9 months of work, this is as good as we think we're going to get it. And so let's move it forward.
And baked within that, I think that there was, because of the disagreement, but the ultimate consent to move forward, like we sort of all took perhaps a half loaf, or many of us feel as if we took a half loaf, and in so doing, we've arrived at a negotiated agreement.
I just want to point out that I have promised to supply a footnote that is not currently in the document we're looking at.
That's correct.
So,
And what we'll do is, Rich, if you provide this to us, what we'll do is send that around to people to take a quick look at as a friendly amendment to the final document. And we'll have a quick chance for people to comment on that when we meet one more time. Just the footnote. So Jane, is that clear? So it would be, I didn't mean to shout, just capital letters to add the distinction of the additional phrase we put in yours. Okay. Jane, does that make sense? Okay, and I know Billy, you've got to go if we haven't already lost you. So I think thank you all for your really hard work. We're looking to meet with the subcommittees for clarification, understanding, and dialogue, not for changing in the document. And then with one caveat of Richard's footnote, we'll look at the document either because of consent or standing aside to let it move forward, would go forward to the Vermont Climate Council, the recommendations 1 through 7. Okay. Any final questions or comments for today? And otherwise, we'll send you off to Thanksgiving and or other holidays that you may celebrate during this time.
May I ask a question real quick? And you guys can all say no, because this might make no sense, but there is one paragraph, and I guess I won't even open it up. The first paragraph of that opening is just a process paragraph about who sat on this task group. And it feels nice to add to me, but we can just leave it out for now, which is fine.
No, because some of the characterization of our conversation, I don't think is appropriate personally. I don't think we need it. The council knows what they're getting. That's just my own 2 cents. And with that, thanks everyone for your great work. I got to go.
Thanks, Billy. Okay, everybody, I also have to jump. All right, thank you, everybody. We will see you all in a few weeks for final conversation, and appreciate everyone's hard work and constructed and very careful deliberation over the last several meetings. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Well.